Welcome to Session 6 of The Lord and the Rings, a Bible study using the works of J.R.R. Tolkien to explore biblical ideas. This is a bit of a unique session. Normally we have an in-person group and then I sit down and record these online versions, but this week we are only doing an online version, so I haven't had a chance to run this by an in-person group, which means that this could get interesting, and I hope that it still manages to be somewhat watchable. But I am recording this on the morning of March 25th, and I hope to have it out by the end of the day, because today is an interesting day in the history of the Lord of the Rings. If you look in the appendix at the back of the Return of the King, March 25th is marked as the day on which the One Ring was destroyed. And as a result, a bunch of Tolkien fans have dedicated March 25th as Tolkien Reading Day. And so I'm trying to get this out on Tolkien Reading Day because, well, I thought that this would be a fun way, for me at least, to celebrate. So to start off, I want to go to The Hobbit. And I want to talk about some of the things that our protagonist, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, experienced on his journey. And I'm going to be focusing on the things in the book, not the things in the movies. The movies kind of tried to stretch things out, and I've got a lot of thoughts on the movies that I'm not going to go into now, but I'm going to focus on what's in the book, and I'm going to focus on the bad stuff, the dangerous stuff. I'm not going to focus on the sections where, like, he stopped in Rivendell and had a nice little rest there. These are the dangers that he faced. First, he was captured by 3 monstrous trolls. He and the dwarves he was traveling with heard noises in the woods. They sent Bilbo to investigate, and Bilbo found 3 trolls who captured him and then captured the dwarves and tried to eat them. Then, while they were crossing the Misty Mountains, Bilbo and the dwarves were captured by goblins. But then Gandalf came in and rescued them, and they fought their way out through the goblin tunnels. But during the fighting and the chaos, Bilbo was separated from the group, and he became lost and alone in the goblin tunnels. And while down there, he came face to face with Gollum, and we have the riddles in the dark, the game of riddles between Bilbo and Gollum, and then Gollum becoming enraged and trying to harm Bilbo, but Bilbo managed to escape from the goblin tunnels and get away from Gollum, only to then be chased into trees by wargs, and then goblins came and nearly burned down the trees that Bilbo and the dwarves and Gandalf were hiding in. Then Bilbo and the dwarves enter Mirkwood, and the dwarves get captured by giant spiders, and Bilbo has to be the one to save them, and so he fights the giant spiders and leads the dwarves to safety. But then, once again, the dwarves are captured, this time by the elves of Mirkwood, and Bilbo has to rescue the dwarves from the halls of the elven king Thranduil, and he puts them into barrels and that are shipped down the river. And then they get to the mountain, and Bilbo goes down into the mountain and has a conversation with the dragon Smaug. And finally, Bilbo took part in the Battle of 5 Armies, a massive clash for control of the mountain and the treasure within it. And so these are some of the highlights of Bilbo Baggins' adventure in The Hobbit. These are some of the most dangerous moments that he faced. And so now I want you to just take a second and think about which of these things required the most courage from Bilbo. Tolkien does say that there is one particular instance where Bilbo does something, and it's the bravest thing he ever did. And so I want you to try to figure out or remember, if you've read The Hobbit, which of these things Bilbo did require the most courage. Okay, I've given you a second to think. The answer is that this is kind of a trick question because the bravest thing Bilbo did is not on this list. No, the bravest thing that Bilbo did actually occurs right here, just before his conversation with Smaug the dragon. And so this comes after Bilbo and the dwarves have found the secret door into the Lonely Mountain. And the dwarves are sending Bilbo in to try to get a lay of the inside and to potentially get some of the treasure that is down there. And so Bilbo is walking down the tunnel that is going to lead into the heart of the mountain, where he knows, or at least believes, there is a dragon waiting for him down there. And as he gets closer and closer to the bottom of the tunnel, he starts seeing like red glow that's reminiscent of dragon fire, and he starts hearing noises that remind him of a sleeping animal, but these noises are louder than he's used to, as if they belong to something that's larger than the normal animals that he comes into contact with. And as he's going down the tunnel, the tension and the fear is building. And then it was at this point that Bilbo stopped. Going on from there was the bravest thing he ever did. The tremendous things that happened afterwards were as nothing compared to it. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone, before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wait. The real battle, the bravest thing Bilbo ever did, was not speaking with Smaug the dragon. It was not fighting the spiders of Mirkwood. It was not facing Gollum alone. No, the bravest thing he did was going on, moving forward in that dark tunnel whenever he knew that there was likely danger waiting for him. The real battle wasn't a physical fight. It was an internal battle that Bilbo faced. And that internal battle was greater than anything that came afterwards. And just to remind you, the things that came afterwards were facing a dragon and being part of a massive battle, a giant clash of armies. And so Bilbo was afraid. He had fear. But he still kept going. He fought the internal battle and decided to go on. In the last session, near the end, I talked a little bit about the Elven King Turgon, and I'm not going to repeat everything, but Turgon was the king of Gondolin, which you should see on your screens right now. And Gondolin was this city that was hidden from its enemies and that had high, strong walls. But Turgon was told, hey, your enemies are closing in around you. You need to abandon your city. You need to take your people somewhere else, or else your kingdom is going to fall. But Turgon couldn't, partly because he loved the city that he had built. He had become attached to it. And partially because he felt that his city was safe, and leading his people somewhere else would require them moving through enemy-controlled territory. It would mean stepping out of the safety that they had experienced and into danger. And so I find it interesting that an elven king, a mighty warrior, a great leader with armies, couldn't step forward into danger whenever called to do it. He couldn't do it. He stayed where he was. But yet, Bilbo Baggins, our tiny little hobbit, whenever he fought the internal battle alone in that dark tunnel, he was able to find the strength to move forward. And that seems a bit backwards. Like, shouldn't the strong, mighty warrior king be able to step into danger and darkness? Like, doesn't it make more sense for him to go into danger than for a little tiny hobbit to go into danger? I mean, hobbits are not exactly known for their skill in battle or their weapon prowess. In fact, Tolkien describes hobbits this way. For they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. Hobbits, as we all know, are sometimes called halflings. They are short. They range in height from 2 to 4 feet. Not exactly super menacing. And while dwarves are also shorter than humans and elves, dwarves at least are like big and muscular. But hobbits aren't. They're smaller. They're less threatening. They're not mighty warriors. Their faces were as a rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day, when they could get them. In my life, my everyday existence, I can honestly say that I have never felt like a mighty elven warrior king. I've never felt like a hero. I've never felt like a mighty warrior who is going to sweep in and save the day from all darkness. No, I tend to feel more like a hobbit. Small, insignificant in a large world. A world that I can barely affect. A world that doesn't even know that I exist. I don't feel like a great hero. I feel like a simple hobbit. I feel small. I feel weak. I also enjoy 6 meals a day whenever I can get them. And sometimes on my journey through this life, on my journey following God through my life, I can look at the obstacles in my way, the dragons that are waiting for me, the battles to come, metaphoric battles. I'm not planning on going up and starting any fist fights anytime soon, but I see those dragons or those battles and I get afraid. Or sometimes my anxiety kicks in and I imagine dragons and battles even when there aren't any. And so, how do we move forward, take our next steps, whatever those might be, in our relationship with Christ, in this life, whenever, on some level, I think we all feel small. We all feel like a tiny little hobbit lost in a wide world. Whenever dragons and darkness appear or seem to be on the horizon, how do we go on? So recently I was listening to somebody who was kind of very knowledgeable on Greek mythology. And they were saying that anytime a Greek mythological story comes out, like a Hercules movie or something of that nature, they get the question from people who know them and know that they're kind of very knowledgeable on the subject. They get the question of how accurate to the real story was that movie? Like, was this movie accurate to the original Greek myth? And that seems like a simple question. It, depending on how it's phrased, it can be a yes or no question. Was this accurate? But the answer is oftentimes much more complicated. This person pointed out that while we are looking back at Greek mythology, the stories that the Greeks were telling, their myths, their legends, were very much alive to them, and they were constantly being retold and changed and adjusted and growing. You'd have one person who would write a story, and then it would get picked up and retold, and different elements would be emphasized by a different writer and would be added to and changed. And different Greek cities would have different patron gods, and so you'd have like one legend that was written in one city that would emphasize how great and powerful the god that that city worshipped was. But then a city who worshipped a rival god would take that story and rewrite it to make their god seem better and make the other god seem foolish and petty. And so there was this constant growth of these stories, and so you ended up with many different versions of the same stories all spread throughout Greece. And then it was further complicated whenever other countries would come in and add and take away their own things. And so some of the stories end up having wildly different versions or wildly different details because the stories were still alive. They were still growing. They were still forming. And so it's really hard to answer, is this accurate? Because you have to answer, is this accurate to every version? Because it might be accurate to one version of the story, but be completely different from another version of the story. So why did I bring this up? Well, I think that as Christians, sometimes we can look on the heroes of the Bible in the same way that people nowadays tend to look at those Greek myths. We tend to look back on the heroes of the Bible and say, or believe, oh, they were just kind of fully formed. They were built different. Like, of course, David is going to slay Goliath. Of course, Daniel is going to have faith and get out of the lion's den. Like, they were so great and so mighty. But we oftentimes forget that they were human beings. I'm leaving Jesus out of this category, but because he was both man and God. But most of the heroes of the Bible were human beings, and they were still forming. Whenever they lived, their stories weren't told. They were like the Greek myths that were being written, that were being formed. They didn't start out as the great heroes. They had to go on their journey. They had to grow and become those heroes. And I think on some level we know this. Like, I've heard sermons that have brought this up. Like, we know that they were human, that they were flawed, and that they had to make an active choice to follow God. But there's kind of a difference between knowledge that you have in your brain and knowledge that you actually believe and act on. And I think that that can be the problem. We see Paul and Peter and all these people in the Bible as these great heroes, and we see ourselves as insignificant, as pathetic, as tiny little hobbits who have no hope of affecting anything. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So I've mentioned this letter quite a few times. It's a very useful letter to mention, but in 1951, J.R.R. Tolkien was writing a letter to one of his potential publishers for The Lord of the Rings. And in that letter, he was also describing some of the other stories that he had written that take place in the same world as the Lord of the Rings. And a lot of these stories would be gathered under the title of the Silmarillion. And many of these stories were things that Tolkien had been working on for decades before he'd even started the Lord of the Rings. And in one section of this letter, J.R.R. Tolkien writes, "The chief of the stories of the Silmarillion, and the one most fully treated, is the story of Beren and Luthien the Elf Maiden. Here we meet, among other things, the first example of the motive, to become dominant in hobbits, that the great policies of world history, the wheels of the world, are often turned, not by the lords and governors, but by the seemingly unknown and weak, owing to the secret life in creation, and the part unknowable to all wisdom but one, that resides in the intrusions of the children of God into the drama." Tolkien is saying that in the story of Beren and Luthien, we have the first occurrence of a theme, a motive, a motif that is going to reappear throughout his mythology. And that idea that is going to reappear is that the great events of the world are often not caused by the lords and governors, by those in power, by the mighty, but by the seemingly unknown, by the weak. And the reason that the weak and the unknown are able to come in and affect the world despite their weakness is because God created them. And whenever God created his children, he put a special fire into them, a special element to their soul that allows them to have the ability to affect things in spite of their weakness. That in spite of their seemingly small stature, they are able to affect the larger world. And it defies human logic. It defies our understanding. But the weak can affect the world and can do great things. Going back to the quote, "It is Beren the outlawed mortal who succeeds, with the help of Luthien, a mere maiden even if an elf of royalty, where all the armies and warriors have failed. He penetrates the stronghold of the enemy and wrests one of the Silmarils from the iron crown of Morgoth." So because Tolkien pointed out that this is the first occurrence in his mind of the motif of the weak affecting the world, I want to kind of run through the story of Beren and Luthien. And it's one of the longer stories of the Silmarillion, so I'm not going to have a lot of time to go through quotes. I'm just going to summarize, and even my summary is going to skip over quite a few details. But in order to understand the story of Beren and Luthien, we have to kind of know what the basic situation of the world was at that time. So this story takes place long before the Lord of the Rings, and it takes place during a time whenever the elves of Middle-earth were fighting a war against Morgoth, an evil spirit who had defied God and was trying to conquer the world. And at one point, Morgoth stole the Silmarils. And these Silmarils were 3 holy jewels that one of the elves had made. And they were these precious things. They were considered the greatest thing that an elf had ever made. But Morgoth stole them, and he set them in his crown. He placed the Silmarils on his crown as decoration and as a sign of how mighty he was. The theft of the Silmarils by Morgoth takes place many, many years before the story of Beren and Luthien, but it's an important part of the story. So, many years pass, and the elves and Morgoth continue their war, and then humans, get drawn into the conflict. And some of those humans side with Morgoth, and others join the elves. Now, Beren was a human man who belonged to a people who decided to ally themselves with the elves. But then Morgoth's power grows greater, his armies grow stronger, and they start capturing more and more territory. And Beren suffers a tragedy. His homeland is destroyed and his people killed or have to flee. And for a while, Beren and his father and a handful of men continue to live in their homeland that has now been overtaken by Morgoth's forces. And Beren and the men with him, they fight the orcs. They wage guerrilla warfare against Morgoth's forces, and they cause a lot of harm to Morgoth's forces. But eventually, the other men are killed, until it's only Beren who remains. And his enemies are closing in on him, and so he eventually flees his homeland, flees the area where he has been waging this small little campaign against Morgoth's forces. And he heads south through dangerous terrain, and with great difficulty and great sadness, he eventually comes to the elven kingdom of Doriath. Now, Doriath was ruled by an elvish king, and this elvish king had a daughter named Luthien, who was considered the most beautiful being to ever exist among the elves. Side note, Tolkien based Luthien on his own wife, so yeah, Tolkien had a lot of love for his wife that really comes through in his descriptions of Luthien. But one day, Luthien is out in the forests of Doriath doing what elves love to do, dancing in the forest. And Beren, who is wandering through the forest, who has been homeless, who has been alone for so long, he stumbles upon Luthien in the forest. And this is actually a reference to a time whenever Tolkien's wife was dancing in the forest with him. And so, once again, Luthien, most beautiful being to ever exist, based on Tolkien's wife. I think that that's a sweet detail. But anyway, so Beren stumbles upon Luthien. And through a series of events, they end up becoming close to each other. And they end up falling in love. But there's a problem. Luthien's father doesn't like the idea of his immortal daughter marrying a mere man, a human who is going to die after a few decades, if that. He doesn't like the idea of her experiencing that pain or of him losing his daughter. If you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies, this is kind of similar to the conflict that Elrond is going through with his daughter, Arwen. But Luthien brings Beren before her father. And her father says, okay, if you want to marry my daughter, you can. If you do something for me, I will allow you to marry my daughter. I will give you my blessing. But I'm going to need something in exchange to help me get over my sadness. I'm going to need you to go to Morgoth's fortress, and I need you to get me a Silmaril. I need you to take one of those holy gems from Morgoth's crown. And Luthien's father says this because he doesn't think that Beren is going to agree to this. And if Beren does agree to this, then it's a suicide mission. Like, who could go into Morgoth's fortress and steal something from his very crown? But Beren, because he loves Luthien and does not wish to be parted from her, agrees. And so he sets out on this hopeless quest. And so he goes and he travels and he gathers some people who owe him a favor. And they go towards Morgoth's fortress. But before they get there, they have to pass another fortress. A fortress that is controlled by Sauron. And as they try to pass by this, they try to sneak past, Sauron captures them. And they are brought before him. And they are imprisoned. And the quest seems like it has already failed. Here are some illustrations by Alan Lee, and on the left we have the interior of the fortress in which Beren is now imprisoned, and on the right we have the outside. But Luthien hasn't been idle this whole time. Luthien's father kind of locks her away because he's afraid that she's going to try to follow Beren and join him on the quest, and Luthien's father doesn't want her to go into danger. This plan wasn't to put his daughter in danger, it was to get rid of the guy who's trying to marry his daughter. And so the setup is kind of like classic fairy tale, like the hero is going off to do an impossible quest so that he can marry the princess and get his happily ever after. And so it's set up very male-centric, like the female in a lot of those stories like doesn't really get a personality or get to interact. She's more of like the prize waiting for the hero, and that's very uncomfortable. But that's not how this story plays out. It's set up like that, but Beren's gotten himself captured. Luthien is kind of under watch by her father. But she doesn't stay locked up. She doesn't stay idle. She manages to escape her guards, and she follows after Beren. And then she finds out he's been captured. And so Luthien has to launch a rescue mission. She has to be the one to save Beren. And so now that like classic male-centric fairy tale has now kind of been flipped on its head. But Luthien goes in and she is able to rescue Beren. And in fact, if you look on the image on the right, if you look down very closely, kind of in the bottom left corner of the picture on the right, you can see Luthien on the bridge to Sauron's fortress. But Luthien is able to successfully get Beren out of his imprisonment. And then Beren, like the hero he is, decides that he can't just abandon his quest. He swore to her father that he would come back with a Silmaril in his hand. And he can't just abandon that. He needs to go and finish this quest so that they can be married, so that Luthien doesn't have to choose between like living an outlaw life with him where they're exiled from Luthien's home and abandoning him. He wants to give her the ability to be with him, but also be with her people. And so he wants to continue on with the quest, even though he believes it's a suicide mission. And because he believes it's a suicide mission, he's going to leave Luthien behind. He is going to go forward all alone because he doesn't want to take her into danger. But Luthien ultimately isn't left behind because she refuses to be. She comes up to Beren and says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but she says, "Are you an idiot? Look what happened last time you went off without me. You got captured and I had to rescue you. No, this quest is not your quest. It is our quest. We're a team. We're going to do this together. And so they do. And I realize now that the picture I'm showing has an element that I've neglected to mention. Luthien has a dog companion named Huan. And Huan is a hound from Valinor, from the land where the spirits who remain faithful to God dwell. And so I think the fact that she has a canine companion makes Luthien even cooler than she already is. But I also think it's pretty cool that she joins Beren on this quest, that she doesn't just go back and become that stereotypical fairy tale damsel, that she is an active part of this story. And it's only because she is there and that she is helping Beren that Beren is able to achieve the seemingly impossible. He is able to take the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. He is able to steal back the Holy Gem from Morgoth. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed Luthien. He would have failed on his own. All the armies of the elves were useless in getting back the Silmarils. No elven warrior was able to get anywhere close to getting back one of the Silmarils. But who managed to do it? A human man. A human that the elves of Doriath saw as weak and unworthy to be a part of their society, unworthy to marry their princess. A human man who had lost everything before meeting Luthien. He's able to steal the Silmaril. Who steals the Silmaril? Luthien. A maiden who everybody keeps wanting to put back into that classic damsel situation. They keep wanting to cut her out of the story. Her father tried to cut her out of the story. Beren tried to cut her out of the story. And they did this not because they hated her. They did it because they cared about her and they cared about her safety and they didn't want her to get injured. But they were still trying to keep her safe, keep her in a place where she wouldn't be in danger, but where she also wouldn't be of any help. So the two people who succeeded, where all the many armies of the elves failed, was a seemingly weak human and an elf woman who everybody kept trying to say, stay home. So it was the unexpected that succeeded. It was those who were seen as weak or were seen better off somewhere else that ultimately were able to steal the Silmaril from Morgoth. And so I'm skipping over quite a bit, but that's the basic story of Beren and Luthien. But I think that I need to go just a little bit further with the Silmaril. So now the elves have one of the Silmarils back in their possession. And some very bad things come from that. There is some infighting that results because of the Silmaril. But ultimately, the Silmaril is useful. Because eventually the Silmaril makes its way to a figure that we've discussed before. Eärendil, a part human, part elf. And the Silmaril guides Eärendil as he sails westward on the seas. And it's the light of the Silmaril that allows Eärendil to avoid becoming entrapped by enchanted isles. It's the Silmaril that guides him on his journey and that eventually allows him to come to Valinor, the place where the spirits who have remained faithful to God dwell. And there he is able to beg for help and forgiveness for elves and men of Middle-earth. And it's there that he is able to get the army that eventually overthrows Morgoth, but he's only able to do it because he has the Silmaril. And then the Silmaril is placed in the sky and becomes Gilistel, the star of high hope that we talked about in the previous session. But that couldn't have happened if Beren and Luthien hadn't taken the Silmaril from Morgoth. If people, a couple who was underestimated by the world they lived in, hadn't acted. And then we see this repeated in The Lord of the Rings. We see a figure who doesn't look like much, who doesn't seem like much, become great. And that individual is Aragorn. Whenever we meet him, he doesn't seem like a king. He doesn't seem like somebody worthy of honor. He seems like a ranger, a wanderer, a homeless vagabond. But looks can be deceiving. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. This poem is in reference to Aragorn. And the second half, perhaps I should have included it in the eucatastrophe lesson, because this is kind of eucatastrophic language, light springing from the shadows. But the first part of the poem is about how looks can be deceiving. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. Appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes gold, something valuable, doesn't look valuable at first glance. Sometimes it doesn't look meaningful, but it can still be. Aragorn, whenever we first meet him, we don't meet him as Aragorn, the rightful heir to Gondor. We meet him as Strider, the ranger of the north, the wanderer, and he doesn't seem like much at first. Whenever Frodo is trying to decide whether or not to trust this Strider person, whether they should follow him from Bree, whether they should let him lead them to Rivendell, Frodo says, "You have frightened me several times tonight, but never in the way that servants of the enemy would, or so I imagine. I think one of his spies would, well, seem fairer and feel fouler, if you understand." "I see," laughed Strider. "I look foul and feel fair. Is that it? All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost." Frodo kind of points out that Strider doesn't seem fair. Like, he looks ragged. He looks like nothing special. He looks worn. But he doesn't feel that way. He doesn't feel foul. And Aragorn is able to kind of laugh at what Frodo's saying. Like, oh, so I look bad, but I feel good. Is that it? He's able to laugh at that. But then he quotes the first lines of the poem, pointing out that things aren't always what they seem. In the appendix, Aragorn is described in the following way. Aragorn's ways were hard and long, and he became somewhat grim to look upon, unless he chanced to smile. Became grim to look upon. He's not the shining image of beauty, and yet he seemed to men worthy of honor, as a king that is in exile. There was hidden depths to Aragorn. Strider the Ranger doesn't seem like a important person, but looks can be deceiving. And Frodo gets a good glimpse of Aragorn as he truly is, as he is deep down whenever the Fellowship passes the Argonath, the large statues that they pass on the river in the Fellowship of the Ring. "Fear not," said a strange voice behind him. Frodo turned and saw Strider, and yet not Strider, for the weather-worn ranger was no longer there. In the stern sat Aragorn, son of Arathorn, proud and erect, guiding the boat with skillful strokes. His hood was cast back, and his dark hair was blowing in the wind. A light was in his eyes, a king returning from exile to his own land. Aragorn starts out not looking like much. But just like Beren and Luthien, he goes on to do great things, to accomplish much, despite the fact that the world that he lived in, the world that he starts the story at, says that he is just a ranger, that he is merely a wanderer. The people up in Bree, they don't think anything special of the ranger. They don't think that there's anything significant to them. But there is. And in fact, we could go further into detail about how Aragorn and his people are viewed, how they are forgotten. We talked about in the lesson 3 on exile, we talked a little bit more about Aragorn and how he and his people are the descendants of the kings and leaders of their kingdom. But now everybody's forgotten that. Now everybody views them as just these wandering folk. And now the world doesn't see them as anything significant. Yet they are. But I still have a little bit of a problem. Because you see, I'm not Aragorn, I'm not Beren, I'm not Luthien. Like, these guys were underestimated. They were considered weak or unworthy or unknown by their society, by the world in which they found themselves. But they still seem mightier than me. Like, Beren was an outlaw who managed to fight Morgoth for a long time and become a big pain in Morgoth's side even before he met Luthien. And so even then he seems like a mighty fighter and a valiant man. Luthien may have been underestimated by her people and may have been shoved away by her father before she escaped from his guards. But she was still an elf, and she was very skilled in magics, and so she was still great even before she went on the quest for the Silmaril. Aragorn, like, if you watch Lord of the Rings or read the books, like, he is an amazing warrior, a great leader, and also skilled in poetry and herb lore. And so these guys still seem like so far beyond me. I identify a lot more with the hobbits, with the small people, with the guys who like 6 meals a day than I do these brave people. Beren, Luthien, Aragorn, they were underestimated by their society. They were considered weaker or insignificant, but they had significance. But the greatest example of this idea comes from the hobbits. And this is what Tolkien's talking about whenever he says in the passage of the letter that I cited earlier, "Here we meet, among other things, the first example of the motive to become dominant in hobbits. That the great policies of world history, the wheels of the world, are often turned by the seemingly unknown and weak." It starts with Beren and Luthien. They are the first example in Tolkien's mind of this idea popping up. But it becomes dominant in hobbits. It becomes strongest and most obvious in hobbits. So let's explore the hobbits. In The Hobbit, Gandalf brings a gaggle of dwarves into the home of Bilbo Baggins. And these dwarves are wanting a burglar who can help them take back their treasure and potentially homeland from Smaug the dragon. And Gandalf says that Bilbo will be a good burglar. And Bilbo doesn't like the word burglar. It seems like to make him uncomfortable. And one of the dwarves tells him, "Oh, well, if you'd prefer, we can call you expert treasure hunter." But then they only call him a burglar and never refer to him as expert treasure hunter, which is just kind of a little funny detail I wanted to throw in. But at first, the dwarves don't think much of Bilbo. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts. He looks more like a grocer than a burglar. The dwarves doubt him. A grocer is somebody who sells food or small household items. They're saying, whenever I saw Bilbo, I didn't think much of him. He looks like he belongs like at the local shop, at the local market, selling things more than going on an adventure with us. But Gandalf replies, "That's right," said Gandalf. "Let's have no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. There is a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself." Gandalf sticks up for Bilbo. He says there's more to him than what you can see. Appearances can be deceiving. And I think there's more to him than even he believes. And so Bilbo goes on the quest. And at first he is not super useful to the dwarves. But as he goes on, he becomes more and more competent, and the dwarves become more and more reliant on him. And eventually he becomes the hero of the story. Without Bilbo, the following things wouldn't have happened in the story. The dwarves would have never made it to the Lonely Mountain. Bilbo saved them from spiders. He saved them from the imprisonment of the dwarves in the Elven King's Hall. They would have never made it to the Lonely Mountain. Smaug's weak point would not have been discovered. This is something that kind of annoys me about the movie, is that they cut out this pivotal thing that Bilbo did. He discovered Smaug's weak point. Smaug wouldn't have been able to be defeated without Bilbo finding that weak point. The dwarven kingdom of Erebor would not have been reclaimed. Once Smaug is dead and the Battle of Five Armies is finished, the dwarves reestablish their kingdom. And that reestablishment brings peace and prosperity to the region in the immediate future. And then longer term, whenever we get to the Lord of the Rings, the fact that there is a strong kingdom of dwarves up in the far north, it becomes a hindrance to Sauron. His armies now don't have free reign in the north of Middle-earth, and so they have to go through this land that is now controlled by dwarves if they want to conquer the northern parts of the world. And so they are able to resist Sauron better because Erebor exists. And without Bilbo, the One Ring would have never been discovered. And without the One Ring, well, then we don't have the Lord of the Rings. We don't have the happy ending. We don't have the eucatastrophe of the destruction of the ring and the fall of Sauron as a result. All this from a guy who looks like he should be selling stuff at the local market. Appearances look deceiving. But there is a hero in Bilbo, and Bilbo didn't know that whenever he started his journey. Whenever Gandalf and Elrond and Galadriel and the important people start to realize that Sauron is returning, the following conversation takes place between Elrond and Gandalf. And in this passage, Gandalf is referred to as Mithrandir. It's one of his many names, but the passage says, "Therefore naught was done at that time, though Elrond's heart misgave him. And he said to Mithrandir, Nonetheless I forebode that the one will yet be found, the One Ring will yet be found, and then war will arise again, and in that war this age will be ended. Indeed, in a second darkness it will end, unless some strange chance deliver us that my eyes cannot see." "Many are the strange chances of the world," said Mithrandir, "and help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter." We've talked about how you should be a bit suspicious whenever chance or luck gets brought up, because we've talked about how a lot of times in Tolkien's work, whenever he's talking about chance or luck, it only seems that way, and what he's really talking about is divine providence, God working. But Elrond is worried that the One Ring is going to be found, and that Sauron is going to arise again, and that he is going to be victorious. But Gandalf tells him it's going to be okay. Things might seem hopeless. That might be a hopeless scenario that you've constructed in your head. But something that you don't see might deliver us. And we might get help from the hands of the weak. And then time passes until we get to the events of the Lord of the Rings. And the ring is brought to Rivendell, and the Council of Elrond occurs. And they are discussing taking the ring to Mordor to destroy it. And Elrond says, "The road must be trod, but it will be very hard, and neither strength nor wisdom will carry us far upon it. This quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. Yet such is oft the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere." Elrond says that we're not going to have enough strength or enough wisdom to overcome Sauron, that it's not going to be strength and the wisdom of like the most wise or the most learned of us that is going to make this quest successful. The weak, the insignificant, they have just as much hope as the strong, because no matter how strong we are, Sauron is going to be stronger. No matter how wise we are, it's not going to be enough to overthrow him. The weak have just as much of a chance of success as the strong in this scenario. But the weak, the small hands, they are often the ones who do the deeds that turn the wheels of the world, while the eyes of the quote-unquote great are elsewhere, while the powerful people are dealing with other things. It's often the small hands that actually do the deeds that affect the world. And then Frodo volunteers to take the ring, and Elrond replies, "If I understand aright all that I have heard," Elrond said, "I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who of all the wise could have foreseen it? Or, if they are wise, why should they expect to know it until the hour has struck?" Elrond seems to be repeating the idea that Gandalf told him in that slide a little while ago. Like, help can come from the seemingly weak, the seemingly insignificant. And now Elrond believes that this is the hour that Gandalf spoke about, that this is the hour of the Shire folk, whenever these seemingly small, insignificant people, these people who are not great warriors, who haven't been involved with like the big historical events, whenever they are going to suddenly and unexpectedly arise and affect the world and potentially save it. In the Two Towers, whenever Gandalf returns, he is speaking with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and they are talking about Boromir and the hobbits Merry and Pippin and what happened and how Boromir tried to take the ring from Frodo, but then he repented and he tried to save Merry and Pippin. And Gandalf says, "Poor Boromir, I could not see what happened to him. It was a sore trial for such a man, a warrior and a lord of men. It was difficult for Boromir to resist the ring. But he escaped in the end. I am glad. It was not in vain that the young hobbits came with us, if only for Boromir's sake." Because Merry and Pippin were with the Fellowship, Boromir was able to have his life end not as the villain trying to take the ring from Frodo, but as a good man trying to save his friends. So it was good that they were there if that was all they accomplished was some redemption for Boromir. But Gandalf goes on. But that is not the only part they have to play. They were brought to Fangorn, and their coming was like the falling of small stones that starts an avalanche in the mountains. Even as we talk here, I hear the first rumblings. Gandalf is saying that the fact that the hobbits are here in Fangorn, it is going to seem like a small thing, but they, as insignificant as they might seem, they are like small stones that are going to start an avalanche. They are seemingly small and weak things that are going to cause something big to happen. And that big thing that happens is, of course, the march of the Ents upon Isengard. Merry and Pippin, because they are there in Fangorn, they cause the Ents, Treebeard and his people, to become furious with Saruman, and they go to war to attack Isengard. Because of the small stones, the seemingly insignificant things, hobbits, Merry and Pippin, caused the downfall of Isengard. Another example is at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Merry is riding with Éowyn into the battle, and they end up fighting against the Witch King of Angmar, the leader of the Nazgul. And Tolkien writes, "Out of the wreck rose the Black Rider, tall and threatening, towering above Éowyn. With a cry of hatred that stung the very ears like venom, he let fall his mace. Her shield was shivered in many pieces, and her arm was broken. She stumbled to her knees. He bent over her like a cloud, and his eyes glittered. He raised his mace to kill. But suddenly he too stumbled forward with a cry of bitter pain, and his stroke went wide, driving into the ground. Merry's sword had stabbed him from behind, shearing through the black mantle, and passing up beneath the hauberk had pierced the sinew behind his mighty knee. 'Éowyn! Éowyn!' cried Merry. Then tottering, struggling up, with her last strength she drove her sword between crown and mantle as the great shoulders bowed before her." It wasn't Aragorn or Gandalf or any of the quote-unquote mighty, the great, the wise who ended the Witch King of Angmar. It was Éowyn and Merry. Merry stabbed the Witch King in the back of the leg and saved Éowyn and provided her the opening she needed to kill him. It wasn't the great. And the interesting thing is that Gandalf has faced the Witch King before and was not able to kill him. But the weak were. And Merry is a hobbit. Obviously, he would be somebody that the world would consider weak. But I also want to focus just very quickly on Éowyn, because I think that there's a lot of interesting psychology to her in the book that kind of gets left out of the movies or minimized in the movies. But one thing that I find interesting in the book is that Tolkien usually has like some criticisms of most societies, even the ones that are good and heroic in his stories. He still has criticisms of them. And one of the things that he criticizes Rohan for is the fact that they prize deeds of war too highly. Like they value horsemanship and warfare a bit too much. Like they're not like Sauron trying to conquer the world, but they do have a society in which they very much tie your honor and your worth to either what you can do on a horse and what you can do in battle. And normally, for their society, those two things are connected because they tend to ride horses into battle. But Eowyn, I would think from the book, I think it's pretty safe to say she is facing some depression because she is living in a society that tells you your worth is tied to what you can do in battle. But yet she's also a woman, and so she's like being told, no, you're not going to be able to ride with us into battle. You're not going to join the men on this trip. And so she's living in a society that is simultaneously telling her your worth is tied to what you can do in battle, but also you're not allowed to take part in the battle. Which I think can very reasonably lead to some self-worth issues. And so I don't have time to dive into that right now, but she was told to stay out of the battle. She was told not to join in. It's kind of an echo of Luthien being told by her father to stay home, and of Beren telling her to go back so she wouldn't be in danger. But Eowyn was also undervalued or underappreciated by her society. But yet it wasn't Gandalf the Mighty who slew the Witch King. It was her with the help of a small hobbit. And so these are kind of the major accomplishments of the hobbits in our story, and we've talked about some of these already. They awaken the fury of the Ents against Isengard. Merry helps slay the Witch King of Angmar. Pippin helps save the life of Faramir. This was left out of the movies, but in that final battle, whenever Aragorn is leading people, the armies, to distract Sauron, Pippin is in that fight, and one of his friends, one of the side characters from Gondor, is like knocked to the ground, and a troll is about to leaning down and is about to kill Pippin's friend, this side character. And Pippin comes over, and because the troll is bending down, Pippin has a good shot at the troll's neck, and so he is able to stab his sword into the troll's neck and save his friend. And then there's Frodo and Sam, who took on the burden of the One Ring, and who took on the burden of being Frodo's strength, because Frodo's strength was being taken up by the burden of the One Ring. And then they got the ring to Mount Doom, where it was ultimately destroyed. And so I feel kind of bad for Frodo and Sam, because I've kind of shoved a lot of their story into like 2 little bullet points. And there are other things that the hobbits did that you could point out, but these are kind of the major ones throughout the story. So I want to go back to that moment I just mentioned, where Aragorn and Gandalf are leading the armies to fight against Sauron, to distract him, to allow Frodo and Sam to destroy the One Ring. There at last, Gandalf and the lords of Rohan and Gondor looked upon death and defeat, and all their valor was in vain, for Sauron was too strong. Yet in that hour was put to the proof that which Mithrandir had spoken, and help came from the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. For as many songs have since sung, it was the Perianath, the little people, dwellers in hillsides and meadows, that brought them deliverance. It wasn't the wise, the mighty, that ultimately brought deliverance. It was the hobbits, the halflings, the Perianath, the little people, whatever name you want to apply to them. It was the weak that brought deliverance. Here's the thing. God chooses the weak. He likes to use the weak in his designs. 1 Corinthians says, "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." God chooses the lowly things, the despised things, to confound the strong things. David was a mighty king, but he started out as a shepherd boy. Christ Jesus, our Lord and Savior, wasn't born into a palace. He was born into a manger, and he was born as a carpenter, which is not the most fancy, prestigious job you can have. Paul started out as Saul, the most unlikely person to spread the gospel, the person who was persecuting the early church. Time and time again, God chooses the weak or the unexpected to do his will. And he can do that in us. Most of us are foolish by human standards. Most of us are not of noble birth. But God can still choose us to move the wheels of the world. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes that he does that so that we know where our strength is coming from, that we're not doing things by our strength, that it is because of Christ Jesus that we are able to accomplish these things. That's why Paul writes, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Because it's not our strength or our wisdom. We're not strong. We're weak. We're foolish. But because of God working through us, we're able to accomplish things. And so it should be in God that we boast, not ourselves, not our own accomplishments. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. We are not supposed to rely on our own strength. God loves using the small and the weak, because the small and the weak better understand that we're supposed to rely on God's strength. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Sam talks about how he really wants to see elves. He's very excited to see elves. And then he gets the chance to meet elves, and it seems like it should be a really exciting experience for him. He's been wanting to meet them for a long time. And so Frodo afterwards asks him, hey, how was that experience? Do you still feel a need to continue out in the world, or are you, now that you've had a chance to meet elves. Are you okay? Like, back in the Shire, back at home? And Sam replies, I don't know how to say it, but after last night, I feel different. I seem to see ahead in a kind of way. I know we are going to take a very long road into darkness, but I know I can't turn back. It isn't to see elves now, nor dragons, nor mountains that I want. I don't rightly know what I want, but I have something to do before the end, and it lies ahead, not in the Shire. I must see it through, sir, if you understand me. Oftentimes I feel like Sam in this passage. Like, I feel like I have something to do, but I don't rightly know exactly what it is. And this kind of like freaks me out a little bit. It causes me some anxiety because like we're told what our purpose on earth is. Like, we have the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations. We are told to bring others to Christ, to show the love of God to a fallen world, that we are supposed to bring glory to God. But those are kind of like general goals. And so I get really paranoid, like, oh, what am I supposed to do specifically in my life at this moment to accomplish those goals? What is the big plan? What exactly do I need to do? Everybody like has a slightly different purpose within God's plan. So how am I supposed to accomplish this? How am I supposed to bring this about? What am I supposed to do? And you probably notice how many times I just use the word I. You see, so often we can see the dragons, the battles on the horizon, or we can imagine ones that don't actually exist, but we see those and we start thinking, oh, what am I supposed to do? How do I get through this? How do I accomplish this? But we are not the ones who are supposed to accomplish this. God is. It's not our strength that is to be relied on. It's on God's strength. You see, sometimes we get so worried figuring out how we're going to slay the dragon whenever God says, no, 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 I don't need you to figure out how to slay the dragon. I just need you to take your next steps with me. I just need you to move forward. And whenever we get to the dragon, I'll worry about slaying it. The I in that sentence being God. We get so caught up in figuring out how to do things that we forget to rely on God. In one of the earlier lessons, I talked about a domination mindset and how the One Ring, it can offer you good things, but it's going to twist those things to evil. It's going to make you more selfish, make your goals more self-oriented, or it's going to focus more on your own plans, your own designs, rather than thinking about what's good for everyone around you, rather than thinking about what God actually has planned. And we talked about how that's dangerous. Well, sometimes whenever we're looking at situations, we feel small and we start thinking about, how am I supposed to do this? And the answer is often that you're not. But God doesn't need you to. He just needs you to move forward in faith, to continue growing your relationship with Him and to trust in Him, because you're not going to do it, but He might do it through you. That's why He uses the weak, because the weak know that they lack strength. And that seems like an obvious statement, but the weak know that they lack strength. And so whenever they do accomplish something, they know that they are accomplishing it because God is working through them. And so we need to remember that we don't have to be the smartest person. We don't have to be the strongest person. We don't have to have it all together to follow God. We just need to keep taking the next steps in our relationship. We don't have to see the whole plan. We just have to take the next steps. And by the time we get to those dragons, to those battles, God will help us. And so we need to remember two things. One, we are weak. To the world, we are insignificant. But our smallness doesn't diminish God's greatness. He can still use the weak things, and he often does use the weak things of this world. And secondly, whenever we do have accomplishments, whenever God does use us, we need to remember that it's still his strength. It's still him, that he chose to use us, but we don't have a reason to boast because the strength still came from God, and we still need to acknowledge him. Earlier, I cut out a bit of dialogue from Gandalf whenever Gandalf was talking about Bilbo. I did a little ellipse to cut out a sentence. So very quickly, because I've already gone over time, I want to read that sentence. "That's right," said Gandalf. "Let's have no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you." Now here's the sentence I want to read, the one that I cut out earlier. "If I say he is a burglar he is, or will be when the time comes." See, sometimes God calls us and we say, "Oh, no, don't call me. Like, I'm not the right person for this. I'm not strong enough. I'm not fast enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not the right person. I don't have the level of faith that a strong follower of Christ needs to have. I'm the wrong guy." And sometimes the answer is, yeah, you're right. You're not the right person. But here's the thing. If you follow God, if you continue taking the next steps, then you will grow in him. And then by the time you reach your destination, the journey will have changed you, and you will now be the person that God needs. See, sometimes we get so caught up in who we are now that we forget that God is a God of transformation and of sanctification, and that who we are now is not who we need to always be, that God will allow us to grow and change and become better than we were. So sometimes whenever we are called, yes, at the beginning we are the wrong person. But if we continue in faith, then we will grow into the right person and be ready for the situation by the time that situation occurs. Bilbo didn't start off as a burglar or expert treasure hunter. He started off as somebody who looked more like a grocer. At the beginning of his journey, he wasn't super helpful. But over time, he changed. He became more competent. And by the end, he is pretty much leading the adventure. He is pretty much the one that the dwarves are relying on. And so the journey with God changes us. Matthew 4:18 through 19 says, "And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.'" Fishermen. Jesus called fishermen to be his disciples, to be the ones that he was going to teach and the ones that he was eventually going to send out into the world to spread his gospel. Talk about the weak, the insignificant, being used to turn the wheels of the world. Like, these guys don't seem special by the world's standards. Fishermen, I doubt they were the world's most eloquent speakers, the greatest orators, or the most theological minded, the most well read in the scriptures. But Christ still called them, and he would use them for his kingdom. And here's the thing. I really doubt that the moment he said, "Follow me," they suddenly became the most gifted speakers. They suddenly became the most theologically sound individuals. They had to grow. They had to spend time with Christ. And eventually, they grew into the people that he needed. They didn't start out as what would be needed. If they stayed the person that they were whenever they called, if they remained just the fishermen that they had been, then by the time Jesus goes back to his Father and sends them out to the world, gives them the Great Commission, if they were still the same fishermen that they were, they probably would have failed. They probably would have fallen apart. They probably wouldn't have succeeded. But they weren't the same people that they were whenever Jesus called them. The journey with Christ changed them. They grew as people. And so whenever Christ sent them out into the world, they were exactly what was needed. I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so, somehow, attaining to the resurrection from the dead. Not that I have already obtained all this, or have already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. We don't immediately become perfect beings whenever we accept the blood of Christ for our sins. We're still stuck in our mortal, fallen, sinful bodies. We still make mistakes. We are still weak. We are still foolish. But the journey with Christ, if we can just take those next steps, if we can just trust him and his strength whenever we see dragons or battles on the horizon, then we will grow. And it's that growth that we need to follow. We need to press on towards the goal. We've not already obtained perfection. We are still undergoing the process of sanctification. We are still fallen. But Christ provides the opportunity to be reconnected to God the Father. But there's still a journey ahead. We still have to press on with our personal relationship with Christ. And as we do that, we need to remember, yes, we are weak, but God can give us his strength. Yes, we might be the wrong person to do what God has called us to do, but God can transform us into the right person. And here's the thing. Even though we are weak, God still loves us. God still cares for us. We may feel insignificant at times. The world may tell us that we are insignificant. Societal pressures may make every single one of us feel worthless at times. But God still cares, and he can still use us. And yes, we are weak, but we don't have to go through this life alone. In fact, we're not supposed to go through this life alone. We're supposed to go through this life together. And that's what we're going to talk about next session. We're going to talk about going through life together, helping each other. But for now, I just want to end with saying your weakness is not a problem for God as long as you lean on Him. And I'm sorry I've gone over time. This is what happens whenever I don't have a physical audience in the room to feel guilty about keeping overly long. But I hope that somehow this has been useful or interesting to you. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for sticking with me, even though I have like the most annoying voice in the world and I ramble a bit. But I really appreciate it, and I hope that you will join me next time for the next session. Thank you.